Hello, Virtual PyCon. My name is Nina, and I'm going to talk about debugging in Python. Whether you use print, PDB, or the debugger in your IDE, you're going to learn something new from this talk. I'm going to cover the benefits of using debuggers in Python, show you a few different types, and even share some of my own tips and tricks with you. The slides are available for this talk. There are plenty of resources throughout, so feel free to download the slides to follow the links. They're available at nina.to/pycon2020. My name is Nina Zakharenko, and I work at Microsoft as a Python developer advocate, focusing on making Azure and VS Code better to use for Python developers everywhere. I've written software for over a decade now at companies like Meetup, Reddit, and HBO. I've worked on projects big and small in a wide variety of organizations. If you'd like to stay in touch, please follow me on Twitter at NNJA. And lately, I've also been live coding on Twitch twice a week, and my Twitch username is NNJAIO. A brief overview of what we're going to learn today. I'm going to cover why you should use debuggers, breakpoints, and other debugger fundamentals. I'm going to talk about my workflow, tools like PDB, IPDB, and IDEs, the new breakpoint built-in Python 3.7, and then demos, tips, tricks, and a little bit of guidance on when to use what. A quick disclaimer that this is my way. There are lots of tools and workflows available for debugging. I'm going to show you the workflow that I use, and that doesn't mean it's the right one for you, so choose what works best for you. I'm going to show you a little demo application. It's a very simple Flask app. There's no data store, and it uses the GitHub Search API to look for popular libraries by stars based on language. And the API data that comes back is JSON, which is pretty standard stuff. Now, this is the meat of the code for this application. We call into the GitHub API, we get a response back, and that response is JSON, and then we do something with it. Let's say we had a bug in our code. How would we go about debugging this with print? Maybe the data isn't looking like we would expect it to. So we would go into our repos with most stars method here, and then maybe we would just kind of start by printing out the items from our response JSON, and let's submit something here and go to our running server, and we'll see that it printed all this stuff out. Okay, so now if I wanted to derive something more useful from this, I might take a look at the API keys returned and keep modifying my print statement until it returns something useful, which is pretty tedious. If you're already using prints though, you might be wondering, well, what's the point of using a debugger at all? Well, the problem with print is print doesn't give us a lot of context. If you're using prints in your code, you're familiar with the process of tweaking what you're printing out because you got it wrong. Maybe you're working with large nested data structures, so you're tweaking or rerunning your code, you're tweaking the formatting, you're running it again. It's tedious. And sometimes the bug is in your print statement. So let's take a look at what debugging might look like. Going back to our code, I'm going to remove this print, and because I'm using Python 3.7, I can just add a breakpoint method here and save. We can just confirm that our server has reloaded the new code, and then instead of constantly going back to our website and hitting it to get data back, I'm just going to curl it in the background here, which is basically the same thing as hitting the page. Now we'll see that we are at an active prompt. We see an arrow here of what line of code we're on, and then we can start typing in here. Now I can interact with my code here. So I can take a look at the items that were returned from the API. I can go ahead and just get one. If I wanted to work with that, I could get the keys from it, for example. I could print or pretty print here, which is already a lot nicer to look at than our whole long printout statement. And something that's really useful is the interact command. So this is kind of just a one line prompt, you'll notice when I press enter, it just continues. If you want something that looks closer to the Python prompt, you can type interact here, and we'll enter interactive mode, and then we can start writing multi-line code. So let's say I wanted to get a representative sample of our items. I didn't want to work with all 30 of them because that's kind of a largest data set. So I can say for item in, let's take a look at 3 items, and then I can print out the item URL. Cool, so that's pretty easy. Once I'm done with interactive mode, I can press Control D to exit out of it. We'll see we're back in our PDB console, and then I can start typing commands like next, which will go ahead and step over the next line of the code. Once I'm done with my debugger, I can press C, and it will continue on until the next breakpoint is hit. That's a little bit better than print, right? And adding a debugger statement wasn't that hard. Notice in Python 3.7, you can simply use breakpoint. I'll cover how you might be able to use debugging for earlier versions of Python, but debugging allows us to easily explore the state of a running program. We can write new snippets of code, we can experiment to our heart's content. You can even save those snippets and add them back to your code base, which is a workflow that I use all the time. I feel like folks who are starting in Python are afraid of using debuggers because it seems like there's just too much overhead and using print is so familiar, but I really want to show you that there's nothing to be afraid of. You can get started with debuggers in no time at all, and it's really going to supercharge the way that you write code and find bugs. You're not going to have to clean up print statements littered all over your code to examine the state of multiple objects. With a debugger, you're really using a tool that's made for the job. A debugger is going to drop you into the point of execution, and it's going to allow you not just to see the string representation of what you're trying to examine, but actually allow you to call it, examine the arguments given to a function, examine other values and variables in the scope, and a lot more. Once I gave up using print to debug, my productivity as a programmer increased, and yours can too. Let's cover a little bit about debugger fundamentals. The most important one is the breakpoint. The breakpoint is the foundation of debugging, and you can kind of consider a breakpoint like a trap. So imagine you're walking along and you're executing code line by line, and then you trip on something and you need to stop. That's a breakpoint. It stops the flow of execution in your program. Now, there are different types of debuggers. You saw a quick demo earlier of command line debugging. PDB is included in the standard library. It's a great option. It's portable. You don't need to install anything else or configure anything else. But I tend to use IPDB, which is installable via pip, and it offers syntax highlighting and nicer tab complete and some of the other nice features of the IPYTHON package. And that's what I'm going to be demoing in a few minutes. But there are a lot more options. So if you're using Python 3.7, you can just use breakpoint, and there are some advantages to this. Like I said, I prefer IPDB, and using Python 3.7's breakpoint, I can set an environment variable to tell the breakpoint method which debugger I want to use. So in this case, I want to use IPDB, and it's super easy to swap it out. I can change it later if I feel like it. I can switch it in the future, and I think this in itself is a great reason for upgrading. Now, another really nice advantage is you can set Python breakpoint to 0, and that's going to allow you to easily skip over any breakpoints at execution. For example, probably want to do that in production, and I'll talk about why that's important a little bit later on. Now, if you're using a version of Python less than 3.7, there are other ways to add breakpoints. You can add them directly into your code. So you import PDB and then pdb.set_trace on the line of code where you'd like to set your breakpoint. You can also set them interactively. So you can run PDB as a module with the -m flag, type in where you want your breakpoints to be. I'm not going to cover that approach because I don't really use it, but with option 1, your breakpoints are a little bit harder to disable. With option 2, if your code moves around, your breakpoint line numbers might change. So, I prefer the first approach, but to each their own. You have options. And I really think that you should learn more about the tool as you use it, but there are only a handful of commands that you need to learn to be productive. There is L for list, or LL for long list. It's going to print out the code around the breakpoint that was hit. There's N to go to the next line, S to step into. For example, if there's a method being called, you can enter into it. Otherwise, it's just going to go to the next line. C for continue until the next breakpoint or until the program completes. And then lastly, H for help. You can also provide an optional command, which is kind of really easy if you forget how the debugger works. All right, let's take a look at debugging with IPDB this time. The first thing that I'm going to need to do is set my Python breakpoint environment variable to IPDB, and I've already installed it via pip. Now, I'm going to modify my code a little bit and move my breakpoint from here to right before we create the query, so the top of this method. Let's go ahead and run our server. And then I'm going to hit my server with curl to trigger the debugger. Now, there are long form versions of all of these debugger commands, but I'm going to be using the short ones. Don't worry, you don't have to memorize them. I'm going to provide a useful cheat sheet. So S means step into. So I'm going to step into the create query method. And this is going to allow me to use A to look at the args that were passed into this method. And then I can use N for next to start stepping through line by line. Now, a gotcha that you want to keep in mind is we're currently on line 18. Do you think that query is defined at this step? So if I try to examine query, will it work? I still do this all the time, but the short answer is no. That's because query is not defined until line 19. So we need to wait until line 18 is executed and step over that line, and now we'll be able to take a look at query. I can use R to jump to the return of this method, which isn't particularly useful for a short method like this, but is useful when you have complex code and lots of points of return. And then I'm just going to go ahead and hit N. And because we returned from the create query method, we're going to jump back up to our repos with most stars method. So now I can just hit N to go to the next line or enter to continue. And let me show you another really nice feature of IPDB. Let's say I grabbed one of my items and I didn't remember which API key necessarily had the number of stars, or I'm sorry. Let's say I didn't remember which key in the JSON contained the number of stars for the repository. So with IPDB, I can start typing here because I know the key has the word star in it. And then I can press tab here. And it's going to go through all of the keys in that dictionary and allow me to tab complete. In this case, the number of stars or people who have starred the repository is called the stargazers count. I'm going to guess that's some weird artifact from the GitHub API. Maybe they used to be called stargazers a long time ago, but now I've saved myself a lot of time. All right, IPDB is pretty awesome. I'm a fan. And if you need some guidelines for command line debugging, I have a cheat sheet that is available at nina.to/PyCon2020 with the other slides. There are other useful commands, for example, until, which will allow you to run until the current line of code is greater than the next, which is really helpful to allow you to break out of a loop. But really, you can be fully productive by starting with the basic commands that I showed you, and then add on others as you need them. And for those of you who are paying attention, yes, my cheat sheets do match my hair. Now, if you're not comfortable on the CLI or you prefer graphical tools, there are plenty available. I'm going to be showing you VS Code today because that's what I use for my daily editor, but there's also a PUDB, which is a graphical CLI debugger. There are lots of IDEs available and a lot of other options. Now, I prefer VS Code. It's what I use for my daily editor, so that's what I'm going to be showing you today. There are just a few setup steps that you have to take. Just download VS Code, and then VS Code comes really bare bones, which I like, and the power is in customizations. So you're going to need to install the Python extension for VS Code for the best experience, and then create a debugger configuration. Note that these are all links in the slides if you need a little bit more guidance. Now, visual breakpoints kind of match a lot of the concepts that we were talking about earlier. This is what the icons look like. The little play is continue. The arrow that jumps over is next. The down arrow is step up. The up arrow is go up, and that's within the stack of execution. We have an option to reset and then stopping the debugger. So let's take a look at debugging with the IDE. So I'm going to go ahead and remove that breakpoint, and instead I'm going to click to the left of the line number that I'm interested in, and we'll see a little red dot appear here. As soon as I click it, it's set. That's my breakpoint. This is called the gutter. Now, when I go to the debug tab, it's got a little helpful bug here. I've already gone and set up a debugger profile, but if you're running the extension for the first time, you'll have to do that. And there's already pre-configured ones for Flask and Django and any other setup that you might need. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and hit this run button, and it's going to start our server in the background. Now you'll notice as soon as the debugger is running, the bar here has changed to a different color. It's now red to indicate that the debugger is active. There are quite a few nice things in this debugger, but let's go ahead and kick off our breakpoint by visiting our website. One of the nice features of VS Code is you can just command click here, and there we go. Now our breakpoint is hit. We'll see this yellow arrow indicating what line it's on. One of the great features of debugging in an IDE is that you can just mouse over these variables here, and it'll show you what the value is. So really simple. You can examine your variables in more detail in this pane on the left. You can also add watches. So that's just an expression to watch that will always be visible. And if I step over here, we'll see that the length of my items is now 30. I can also see the breakpoints that are set. Right here, and check and uncheck them. One of the really nice options for debugging in VS Code is something called a conditional breakpoint. So you can right click on this breakpoint and edit it. And you can say, you can enter an expression here. So the breakpoint will only be hit when the expression evaluates to true. In this case, let's say I only care about hitting the breakpoint when the languages, only Python is selected as a language. So I'm just going to hit enter there. And let's try this out. If I select JavaScript and submit, we should see our server return. And if I select just Python, we'll see that our breakpoint was now hit. So this is very, very useful. Another useful VS Code trick is something called jump to cursor. So let's say that I wanted to hit my GitHub API with a different set of languages than what the web server returned. Maybe there's a bug and I don't necessarily want to work through the scenario that would allow me to hit this breakpoint again. I can go to the line that I'm interested in, and I can go to jump to cursor, and this works both forwards and backwards. So when I jump to cursor here, my code has now, you can think of it as rewinding. And I can open up the debug console, which you should see if your font isn't super huge like mine is. And then let's take a look at our languages. Right now it's just Python, but let's say that I wanted to change that to both Python and Ruby. I've now changed this variable before the method was called. And when I jump over and take a look at my parameters, we'll see that the language has now changed. And I can go ahead and keep running my code. So super, super useful. One more thing that I wanted to show you about debugging with Flask is, let's go to our template. For those of you who have worked with templates, you know how difficult it can be. We can add breakpoints right in our template. Let's go back here and uncheck the breakpoint in API.py and then go ahead and submit our form. Now, just like before, I can hover over these variables and the debugger is going to show me what values they contain. So this is very, very, very useful. Okay, so there are lots of options available. How do you know when you want to use what tool? Well, to be clear, I rarely use PDB from the standard library. I think the functionality is too limited, but it's good to know about. If you're working on a machine where you can't install additional dependencies, for example, it's a great tool to have in your toolbox. But my personal preference is I use CLI debugging for small programs and scripts, and sometimes I just want to work from the command line. I don't necessarily want to do a lot of clicking around. I reach for IDB debugging when I'm working with complex code or large code bases. So once my code gets really complicated, or if I need to dive in and debug templates, that's a great tool. But choose the strategy that works best for you. There are a few tips and tricks that I wanted to share with you. A really simple one, and this took me a long time to figure out. You can just press enter to rerun the next command in the debugger. I've spent a lot of time typing N unnecessarily. If your debugger is stuck in a loop, you can use the until command to keep running the debugger until the line exceeds the current line. We all know how important tests are. If you ever get stuck figuring out why a test is failing, you can go ahead and throw a breakpoint in that unit test. So I do that all the time. It's really handy. But one of my favorite tricks, my favorite hacks, I showed you interact earlier, and that allowed me to jump into a Python interpreter, but all of the stack, all of the context that was available at my breakpoint was available in that interpreter. Now, this is a trick allowing you to use IPYTHON as your interactive mode REPL by creating a file called a PDBRC file, which is a .configuration file. And you can download mine at nina.2/pdbrc. So not only do you get that nice IPython shell with syntax highlighting and tab completion if you do this, but you also get the fancy stuff like using magic methods in IPython for multi-line paste. I'm not going to cover, I'll show you a quick demo, but I'm not going to cover too much of this, but you can get really fancy with your PDBRC. Ned Batchelder has posted his online. He has some really useful aliases like NL to go to the next line and to print nearby lines for context. But let me show you quickly how this looks. Let's go ahead and kickstart our server again and then hit it with curl. Now we're back at our IPDB prompt. You saw earlier that there's a built-in interact command that will drop me into an interactive Python terminal. But this is kind of the standard terminal here. It's a little bit clunky. Now, if we hit Control D to exit out of this and we use our new interact I alias, that's going to dump me into a fully featured IPython debugger, which is much, much nicer, but I still have access to all of my same variables. So looping over 3 items, we'll see that we have syntax highlighting, and it's a lot easier to navigate. We even have parenthesis matching, which, you know, super useful. So this is probably one of my favorite hacks. And then you can just press Control D to exit out of Interact I mode. Something else I wanted to show you that is awesome is a feature of VS Code, which is debugging in Jupyter Notebooks. It was officially released in the fall of last year, and now it's part of the suite of Jupyter Notebook support. This is, I think, extra exciting for the data scientists in the audience. So let's take a look at what that looks like. Let's open up a notebook here and go ahead and run it. It's it's going to start the Jupyter server and display a pretty simple graph here. All right, here we go. Now, if I wanted to debug this, I can just set a breakpoint here and click on debug cell. And we'll see, just like earlier, there's our line of execution. We can go ahead and step over. And just like before, I can mouse over these variables to take a look at them. So I think this will make working with Jupyter Notebooks much, much easier. Now, there are a few gotchas that you need to be mindful of. You really don't want to leave breakpoints in your production code. It could halt your whole running program and make your boss very angry with you. And you don't want to be responsible for that. So if you use Python 3.7 and breakpoint, like I showed you earlier, there's an environment variable that you can use to prevent that, but really it's best practice not to commit code with breakpoints in it at all. A tip here is you can take care of that really easily with Git pre-commit hooks. Pre-commit hooks prevent commits into Git that match certain conditions, which sounds hard, but thankfully there's a library that does that for you. It's at pre-commit.com. It's written in Python. You can just pip install pre-commit, and it comes with a debug statements pre-commit hook that you can enable. And it does the smart thing. So instead of just checking for keywords in a file, it actually uses the AST module to check for imports, check for debug statements, and also check for the new Python 3.7 breakpoint method call. And that'll be a lot easier to future-proof as the Python language grows and evolves, because you can set up other pre-commit hooks. For example, to run a linter, check for trailing white space, check for unused imports, etc. So all around a very useful tool. All right, wrapping up, by now, you should have a pretty basic understanding of how debugging works in Python, as well as all of the tools that are available, from PDB in the standard library to graphical debugging in IDEs. And remember that using a debugger in your own software is a way of supercharging your productivity, because fixing bugs is a process of confirming one by one that the things that you believe to be true about the code are actually true. And when you find an assumption that isn't, you found a clue. And a debugger is a really great tool to allow you to do that. So I've hoped that I've given you the confidence to allow you to say goodbye to print and hello to the debugger. And thank you all so much. Please go ahead and download the slides at nina.2/PyCon2020. I've linked to a few additional resources at the end. You can follow me on Twitter at nnja or on Twitch at nnjaio. And please check out Python at Microsoft at nina.2/ms-PyCon2020. Thank you.